Welcome to SciTech Culture with Steve Kern and Ben Warner, where we examine science, technology, and culture in the 21st century. Visit our website at scitechculture.com. Hello and welcome to SciTech Culture. My name is Ben Warner and I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague Steve Kern. How are we today, Steve? We'll have to be careful what we say because, Twitter might just, fact check us.
This is one of the most interesting things I've seen happen on social media. And it's because it's all about the ethics of where this could end up.
I think we've talked about this in the past, like what type of example or whatever it was going to use that would lead to this sort of thing. I don't think we quite envisaged this particular scenario, but for those that haven't obviously seen the news, it's Trump in his recent tweets where Twitter, I guess, was forced into a position where they had to take a stand on some of the things he's been putting up there and the way they chose to do it. I think the two that sort of stick out are the one where I think he was talking about mail-in voter fraud or something, and they put a link saying, "Oh, well, actually check the facts about this." And then the other one was where they actually hid the tweet and said that it was
promoting violence.
That's right. He violated Twitter's civic integrity policy. So that was the way they chose to do it in terms of handling that. The thing is, and we were just talking about this where we got on, that it's a bit of a diabolical sort of situation to deal with. In that, I would have thought that given how they've handled other users in the past when this sort of things happened, it's pretty much a straight up ban off the platform, and that's it. It's like you violated the terms of service or the agreement terms of usage, and you're off. Now, obviously, they're stuck here because it's Trump. It's not the type of user that you can just throw off willy nilly because he's arguably and I hate to say it, it's no excuse, but it's essentially, their biggest user and I guess their biggest promoter.
Are you suggesting this is a commercial decision?
Well, I'd have to imagine that there's a component of that to it, and also, I guess, the other component being backlash from his supporter base.
This is what's so fascinating about it. So right from the start, Ben, back in the old Fist Chat days, you and I think pretty much always took the view that social media wasn't or was a publishing platform, whatever the legalities of it were back then, and should be then subjected to those legalities. So, as a publishing platform, if you say something that's defamatory, basically we've seen people go to court and end up paying the price for that.
Yeah.
President of the US is interesting because he's a public figure, and I'm sure he argues, or has argued anyway, that he's just speaking his mind, and that anyone who's trying to silence him is from the other side of politics. So it's very interesting. Yet he's made some, I think, undeniably outrageous claims, one of which Twitter chose to obscure, so you couldn't read it. Then that was the civil whatever policy.
Yeah.
And the question to me, or the question I would pose then is, right or wrong, we should be able to see that post, because as the public we have a right to know what he said so we can decide. And yet, if it's false or misleading, and it's being published, it's a contradiction that needs investigation.
I guess, quickly, I guess is the concern that him putting those, say, false or misleading statements out there, that there's going to be a bunch of people that are just going to follow what he's saying no matter what, and that could potentially cause other issues. But then that's effectively meaning that Twitter's making a value judgment on what's being said and who are they to actually say that in an environment where, again, he has the right to say that, we have the right to see it, but also the right to respond to it accordingly. But the interesting thing too is that in addition to that idea of was it a commercial consideration, was it a backlash consideration, and all of those things, there's also the fact that he is the president and he can potentially take action against them, which is, as he's trying to do with this executive order that he signed, which I was reading through off of that article on The Verge, and it just seemed like a monstrosity of a set of terms and documents, and like this argument over whether or not places like Twitter are a public square or a publishing platform, which is what we were talking about before. But also that at its essence, it's really just like he should have just written on there, Trump is allowed to tweet whatever he wants on Twitter rather than trying to do all these legalese that they're trying to get through, because there's a lack of understanding that what they're doing in that executive order can apply to lots of platforms, pretty much anything that's got like a comment-based system.
But this is what I find fascinating about it, because it's another classic Trump contradiction. I actually think there's a lot of merit in the legislation he's trying to put forward. The actual case itself, I think, is 180 degrees in the other direction. But it then opens up the even deeper question about, right to speak, censorship, a whole lot of things around what he's saying. And he makes a good point that if his political opponents using the protocols that Twitter's currently using could silence him. And that could then happen to anyone, any party, any political persuasion in the future. So it's really interesting. And I think it comes back to what you originally said, which I think then the only option isn't to obscure a tweet or to even point out that it's factually incorrect. It's just to ban him from that site. And if people want to hear his views, then they have to go to trump.com or something.
The interesting thing, though, with the ban is that although I think that was the option that should have been taken here, because then that would have been consistent with what they've been doing the rest of the time. The problem is that because of this particular user, in effect, you're still going to get the same response in terms of backlash, because it would be seen as a silencing mechanism on his part, even though Twitter's being, if they had banned him, they were being consistent with everyone else that had ever behaved that way on the platform, and it had violated their terms of service. So I would imagine that when they were huddled in a boardroom somewhere, trying with their whiteboards and their the whiteboard markers, trying to work out a plan of attack on this one, that they would have had to have wrestled with this particular issue, because Trump is not your typical Twitter user.
Well, he's not. And one of the things is it is the real Donald Trump, right? And he is who he says he is, and his views are his own. Which, if you get back to the public square debate, then, well, I guess he can say what he likes. Interestingly, though, let's face it, on social media, and Twitter's just one of the many social media platforms, there's all sorts of spiteful invective from people pretending to be people they're not, people with a political motive and otherwise. And yet, another argument could be, why pick on Trump? When Twitter's got another 1 million users who are probably a lot more inflammatory and dangerous than Trump is. So, I don't think there's any easy answer to any of this, and I'm glad that this is playing out the way it is, because I hope it forces everyone, from governments and regulators through to users, to think very carefully about not only what we say, but how we should interpret and interact with the things that people say online.
I guess on a macro level too, it's kind of like the ultimate examination of what actually are these platforms, like at their core, what should they be defined as? And that it's like that hasn't actually happened properly in a way, and it almost seems like it needs to be, because the platforms are crossing different boundaries. So there's a publishing platform, as you could arguably say. There's a public square element in the sense that you could say inflammatory things on there, and if you take into account the fact that you've got like those riots going on in Minneapolis at the moment, and if you tweet about things according to that are misleading or intended to incite behavior, that's much more significant than just a publishing platform and suing because you're someone said something bad about you, and they're sitting in a very murky area that needs to be defined in order to better handle this type of situation, I think.
I agree, and I think it's probably a very nervous time for the social media platforms themselves, especially with the US election coming up. because they really have to they're heading down the path where they're going to have to check every post because they could well be liable. Now, we know what happened out of 2016. Any mischief from other states playing out on these platforms, but what about homegrown mischief? You know, it's a very, very dangerous situation. And if these platforms finally get nailed as publishers, it has huge consequences for revenue, as we know, around news, legitimate news sites and news generating or content generation. Has huge, you know, that whole free model suddenly falls over. And then on top of that as well, like, would it mean that everything political is banned? Would politicians have to be banned and removed from Facebook and Twitter and any other social media site in future to stop political interference online? It could be just a domino or an iceberg. It's a situation where, you know, I think the election will be critical in determining how social media proceeds after 2020.
And I guess just finally looping in that other story that we were talking about where we got on with Facebook and censorship around posts to do with the coronavirus that are misleading, etc. And it kind of ties into that as well, everything that we've been talking about with Twitter here, in that you know, labeling posts as how did you put it? It was like sort of graying them out and saying, you know,
so
did you
realise?
Yeah. So did you realise that this was fake news? Something along those lines.
But with your name in there, so effectively it's labelling you as a poster of fake news, and unfortunately, some of the people who post this fake news believe it. So some of the backlash I've seen on Facebook has been quite incredible, and I mean the artificial intelligence picking up "I hate you, Facebook, you fascists," etc., would be probably cause for concern in the Facebook boardroom as well. I mean, personally, I think, you know, Facebook and Twitter would be much better off without these people on these platforms. But you know, I'm not running a business.
Yeah, exactly. And just one last final point is like on the other end of the people that are working at those companies, that how do they decide, how do they curate, how do they draw the lines in terms of what is permissible or not? Because again, it comes down to individual value judgments.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in the last few years, since 2016, of course, we've seen, I think, all the social media platforms take additional care and probably clean up their platforms to a certain extent. But by the same token, you know, they can't clean everything up. They can't regulate everything online. And, you know, this leaves loopholes for all sorts of nastiness going on these platforms in the background, outside of your social circle, outside of the people you follow. And there's all sorts of illegitimate deals and trades and all sorts of things going on. And I guess, you know, once again, this is something which could call the social media platforms to account and have, you know, really great consequences to their future business models.
Absolutely. All right, we might wrap it up there. I don't think Trump's actually finished on his trajectory at the moment. I think we're halfway through this particular story, so we'll have to maybe check in a little bit next week to see what happens over the coming week.
Well, I'll tell you what, you know, I think now he's going places which either shows he's under stress or I don't know, starting to lose what he had for 3.5 years.
Someone just needs to tell him there's only 6 months to go.
It might unfortunately mean someone just tap him on the shoulder and just tell him not to bother running again.
Exactly. All right, so don't forget our website, SciTechCulture.com. You can get all of our links and content there. You can subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channels, our RSS feeds, and you can watch us on any and all of your devices, and we greatly appreciate your visit to our website. All right, so that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.